rights of all Ugandan people, and that in this particular moment, our thoughts, our hearts, and our solidarity are with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Ugandans who are under attack by the Anti-Homosexuality Bill. A bill which is probably one of the most draconian pieces of legislation anywhere in the world. And that's saying something. There's a lot of very homophobic regimes in many, many different countries. There's a lot of very vicious anti-gay and anti-lesbian laws in many countries. But hardly any country comes close to this legislation that is now being put before the Ugandan Parliament. What is so shocking is not just the fact of introducing the death penalty for so-called, quote, aggravated homosexuality and so-called, quote, serial offenders, but the fact that life imprisonment will now be imposed for any kind of homosexual act. Not a gay sexual act, but even merely touching another person with homosexual intent. And life imprisonment will also apply to any person who conducts a same-sex marriage or participates in a same-sex marriage. You'll have a sentence of 5 to 7 years for anyone who gives advice and support to LGBT Ugandans, who belongs to an LGBT organisation, who provides funding or other premises for LGBT organisations, for anyone who provides safer sex advice or counselling for LGBT Ugandans, they will face 5 to 7 years jail for so-called promotion of homosexuality. And to top it all off, the Ugandan government has introduced an absolutely unique anti-gay law in that any person, any Ugandan citizen or Ugandan resident who commits any of these so-called crimes anywhere in the world will be liable to arrest and imprisonment. And it's written into this law that Uganda will use its extradition treaties to snatch back from overseas any Ugandan person or any Ugandan citizen or resident anywhere in the world who commits any of these so-called new crimes. That is truly, truly, truly draconian. That is worse than Iran, worse than Saudi Arabia, worse than many, many other countries. And we're here to say today that these laws, these proposals before the Ugandan Parliament are not only an affront to LGBT human rights, they're an affront to human rights full stop. They go against international law. They violate the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. They violate the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They violate the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All these laws, which Uganda has pledged to uphold, clearly state that everyone is entitled to equal rights and protection against discrimination. This law goes against those principles. We're saying to Uganda, uphold the laws that you have promised to uphold. Do not violate this principle of equality and non-discrimination that you have said that you will support. Honour the agreements you have made. We're not trying to impose Western values on Uganda. We're asking Uganda to uphold the universal humanitarian laws that all the nations of the United Nations, including Uganda, have pledged to uphold. We also want to remind the Ugandan government that the existing draconian anti-gay laws, the laws that already exist before this bill was ever tabled, that those laws were of course imposed by the British colonial administration in the 19th centuries. They are laws that were not authentic Ugandan laws. They were laws imposed by the British imperial administration. They were laws imposed upon Uganda by the Western colonizers. And for Uganda, which now boasts itself as an independent nation, for Uganda to uphold and maintain laws imposed by colonialism goes against the whole principle of a sovereign, independent nation. And we know that one of the reasons why the British imposed these laws was part of a regime to control and suppress the Ugandan people and to destroy indigenous culture. We know that before the colonialists came to Uganda, homosexuality existed in Uganda and other African nations. And we know the way in which the colonialists used that fact to justify their colonialist agenda. They argued, as did the British missionaries who went out to Uganda to colonize the minds of the Ugandan people, they said that because homosexuality existed in Uganda, this was a reason why Uganda needed to be colonized and civilized. They cited homosexuality as justification for their colonial ambitions. And so there's a very clear relationship between colonialism, racism, homophobia, and the anti-gay laws in Uganda. These are not authentic African traditions. The real import into Uganda is homophobia, not homosexuality.
Yeah.
Finally, we all know that Uganda has for a long time been scapegoating and demonizing its LGBT citizens. For many, many years, LGBT Ugandans have been the victims of a witch hunt, a moral panic, an attack on human rights. The scapegoating of LGBT Ugandans is part of a process by an authoritarian regime that wants to deflect attention from its own failings, its own corruption, its own tyranny. And so just as Robert Mugabe used homophobia as a weapon to distract Zimbabweans against his own failed state and against his tyranny and human rights abuses, so President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda is using homophobia and attacks on LGBT Ugandans as a way of deflecting attention away from the failure of his regime. The failure of his regime to tackle corruption, the failure of his regime to tackle poverty, the failure of his regime to tackle hunger, the failure of his regime to defend and support the human rights of all Ugandans. Because just as LGBT Ugandans are under attack, so are all civic organizations in Uganda. All the civil society groups in Uganda today are under attack by a regime that was once democratic, that once did bring hope to Uganda, but has now turned into a tyrannical regime whereby the opposition, the trade unions, the church group, all those who speak out against human rights abuses and for democracy suffer great oppression. We remember during the last elections how the main opposition leader, Kizza Besigye, was framed on charges of rape and other offences by the Ugandan regime to destroy support for him and the opposition movement, the Forum for Democratic Change. We know how those elections were suppressed and rigged to to stop the opposition